Okay. Thank you. Maybe, should I use the mic? Can people hear me in the back? Use the mic? I'll use the mic. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here and to see so many people interested about their water. And so this is a presentation I typically give usually in the spring and then many times through the year with different iterations. I tailored it somewhat to today's presentation, or today's specific, your interest, I should say. So let's get started. And I will start by just acknowledging all the fine young men and women who are working in my lab. Really, they're the ones who are getting it all done. They're the boots on the ground and the fins in the water, collecting the samples and generating all that good data. And I'll move now to talk about the concept of a watershed, and that is like so very applicable here on the North Fork, right? The idea being that any of the water that falls on ground has this double importance. It becomes our groundwater, which is our drinking water source, and the water that we don't extract then discharges to surface waters and has an effect on coastal ecosystems. And just to talk about how that happens, I just want to differentiate groundwater versus streams versus runoff, and really emphasize the very important role of groundwater. Sometimes these concepts, or in fact, the concept runoff, I think, is sometimes misused, right? And to be really official, if you wanted to break things down, when that water does hit the watershed, technically then there would be three fates. Or I should say, when it hits the watershed and it's going to go to surface waters, there's three ways that can happen: groundwater, streams, or runoff. And like runoff, for that to actually happen, it actually has to be happening right at a water's edge. Because then otherwise, even if the water hits a road, for example, yes, it runs off, but it runs into the ground and becomes groundwater. So really about 95% or more of the water that goes to surface waters does so as groundwater. And that makes therefore things like streams and actual physical runoff very, very low. And even streams, for example, like freshwater streams, like say Madison Creek, that's also fed mainly by groundwater. So really, groundwater is the primary source of fresh water that's going from land to sea. And I think oftentimes that word runoff can be used in different ways, right? So some people, when they think runoff, they may be referring to fertilizer, or they may be referring to some other source of pollution. But to be very technically correct, and I'm putting this up front so we're all on the same page, runoff is the physical action of water hitting a solid surface and then going right into surface water. And again, if we were going back, I don't know, even just a decade, people say, well, where's the water problems coming from? People just sort of off the cuff would say, oh, it's the runoff. But really, runoff is not really by volume a very big issue, and particularly on the nitrogen front. Now, there is one caveat I'm going to add here, and I'm doing this probably too early, but we can come back to it later. Is that physical runoff in the times when water does make its way directly from the surface of land and directly into surface waters, that can be a potent source of bacteria, for sure. But anyway, while I was covering watershed, that was just one topic I wanted to be clear on up front. And then also on the groundwater front, also talk about how quickly groundwater moves from land to sea, particularly here in the North Fork. I took this out of a very recent USGS report. It is the most comprehensive and up-to-date groundwater model that exists for Long Island. When Suffolk County puts together its watershed plan, it relies on the United States Geological Survey to understand groundwater. They are the authorities on how groundwater moves in Long Island. They have an incredibly sophisticated model, and they're doing some very exciting things. There's more to come. But this is a 2021 report that updated the groundwater travel times. And so what you see, and I just, as you can see, I had to sort of piece this together because it was two different figures. But what I'd like you to note is that for areas west of here, some of the groundwater travel times can be hundreds of years, right? However, here on the North Fork, what you see is that outside of this little sliver in the middle, most of the coloration there is orange or red. And that's actually good news in one way, because what that means is that in a short amount of time, almost all the groundwater gets renewed, right? And that's happy news. The happy news there is that action taken today can have effects in short order. And I'll come back to that later in the presentation. So now I just want to show here how much, and we all know this, of course, the character of Suffolk County has changed from the 20th to the 21st century. And certainly the same is true for the North Fork. This is just showing Suffolk County and showing how as the area of Suffolk County, it went from a rural county to a very suburban county with more than 1.5 million people, making it more populous than any county in New York except for Brooklyn and Queens. The population was increasing and the nitrogen levels in the ground increased as well. And specifically leading to higher elevated levels of nitrate in groundwater. And the levels we see now on average in Suffolk County put us in some of the higher levels you find in the country. So this is a paper from some scientists from Duke University and some other places. And if you look at that y-axis, what you'll see is it tops out at 200 million people. So this is looking at all of the United States population and asking the question, what's the concentration of nitrate in their drinking water? And the answer is for 2/3 of the country, it's less than 1 milligram per liter. So at an average of 3.8, we're more towards the other tail, elevated. Not the highest in the country, but it's elevated and it's on average. And I will emphasize because, again, I can't, if I showed all the slides I have at this time, we'd be here all night. So I pulled some slides out. There is a lot of variability, of course, right? And so there's plenty of areas that are well below this, but also some that are well above this. And you can kind of see some of those areas in this map here that is put together by Suffolk County. And as you look at that map, you can see there certainly are some hot spots here on the North Fork. Okay, and I'm a marine scientist, not a medical doctor, but I do want to talk about public health and nitrate just briefly, only slide on this. At the university, as you probably know, there's a medical school. And in that medical school, there's some epidemiologists. And when you speak to those people about health concerns and what's in the water, what might be a concern, one thing that they would mention would be nitrate. Now, on the one hand, the standards for nitrate are at 10 milligrams per liter, and that's pretty rare. Hard to find a well at that level in general. However, there's emerging research, and I should probably go to the next one here instead of leaving that one up there. You can see this international agency called nitrate probably carcinogenic. And of course that's at high levels, but these studies here, I'm citing many, I mean there may be 20 there, in the last decade or so have made links between elevated levels of nitrate and some types of cancer. Now these are epidemiological studies, right? So they're not feeding people nitrate and seeing the outcome. I don't have time to go into the limitations of such studies, but there's been many of them, right? So suffice to say, and then beyond potential cancer risks, there's also potential adverse birth outcomes with individuals who consume higher levels of nitrate. And these are levels lower than the current EPA standard. EPA standard is 10 milligrams per liter. You can see this is at 3 milligrams per liter. Maybe we could put a range of somewhere between 3 and 5, depending on the study, sometimes lower than that. But I bring this up to say the rest of my talk will not be about medical issues, but rather, I bring this up simply to say, this is just another reason we want nitrogen in groundwater as low as possible. So now moving on, and I should just mention that the EPA is currently performing this integrated risk information system assessment of nitrate as a contaminant. I won't get into politics, but I'll just say that this started in 2015 and was paused in 2017, and the EPA just restarted in 2023. I'll let you think about why that may have all happened. Okay, so the nitrate levels are increasing, and why is that happening? Well, there's been many studies on that, and again, if we went back 10 years and we said, oh, there's high levels of nitrate in groundwater, people might say, oh, well, it must be from the runoff, right? Or it must be from the fertilizer. But actually, there's been a series of studies, and cited them all up here during the last decade or so, and they all came to the same conclusion using models. Essentially said that most of the nitrogen going from land to sea on Long Island is from wastewater. And that should not be at all surprising, because Long Island in general, and I'll talk about the South Fork in a moment, North Fork in a moment, but in general is, there's not a lot of agriculture. Now we get to the North Fork, there is more agriculture. And there are slivers of the North Fork where fertilizer is the main source of nitrogen. However, the fact that it's wastewater for all of Suffolk County, what that generally tells you, and it's, fertilizer comes in second. What that tells you is anytime you get a cluster of many homes together and many unsewered homes, not connected to a sewage treatment plant, wastewater will become the strongest source of nitrogen. So if you had therefore a situation where you had a lot of farms and then you switched to a lot of homes, well, that switching may not change, it would change what's the primary source, but may not change the total amount of nitrogen going from land to sea. Okay, this is a map that I generated last September, and it represents monitoring that my lab did last year, April through September. So about 5 or 6 months of data. And what it shows is a series of what we call water quality impairments. And it's mainly harmful algal blooms, I'm going to talk about in a little bit, and low oxygen zones, which I'm also going to talk about. Yeah, and some other events, fish kills and things like that. And what you can see is these events are widespread all across Long Island, Montauk into the city. And you can see again, this is 2023, and the region of the North Fork, we've got different harmful algal blooms, freshwater, marine, as well as low oxygen conditions, even a turtle kill that occurred in Jockey Creek. And I put in also here, this is just last year, but I just pulled out, I've been doing these maps for more than 10 years. So I just pulled out some of the more recent ones just to show you it does change. So this was 2023. Here's 2022, and so things change a little bit. You can see some of the locations that pop up are different. More of the freshwater harmful algal blooms in 2022, just the freshwater harmful algal blooms in 2021, but different locations. So things can change year to year. Some things are consistent, but some things do change. And then here's 2020. I think I don't go back further than that. And in this case, again, some freshwater harmful algal blooms here, and then some fish kills in some creeks as well. So that just gives you a sense of what things have looked like. So I'm going to now go in and talk about some of these harmful algal blooms, something I've been studying for quite some time. They can generally be broken down into 2 types. One type that makes a biotoxin. So they actually contain a compound within the algae, and these are microalgae in the water, that is actually toxic to humans. And I'll talk about a couple of those, or to animals. And then there's a second class, sometimes I call them ecosystem disruptive. They're not going to poison people, but they can lead to adverse ecosystem impacts, fish kills, the die off of shellfish, loss of seagrass and such. And my lab has done a lot of studies during the last decade plus, looking at the role of high levels of nitrogen and these harmful algal blooms. And for many of them, most of them actually, higher levels of nitrogen makes them grow faster. And then also some of those biotoxins I mentioned are actually rich in nitrogen, so they can make more toxin if given more nitrogen. And I'll point out the examples I believe. So just to dive into a couple of these, I'm going to start with the freshwater ones. They're sometimes called blue-green algae blooms. That's sort of the more general name. They're actually cyanobacteria. And this is Lake Agawam in Southampton. You can see the contrast of that ocean water with the lake water. And we worry about these because of their toxins. The most common type that we see actually here in the North Fork, as well as across Long Island, is this organism microcystis. It makes this compound microcystin, and this is a gastrointestinal toxin. Now, in happy news, there's happy news about a toxin. No one's drinking the surface waters here in the North Fork or on Long Island. So this is not a threat to human health, but there could be animal implications towards that end. For example, there are events sometimes where large mammals are actually killed by these toxins by drinking large amounts of water. This is an event that happened in Africa in 2020. But you can come up with parallel stories maybe with regards to cattle in the Midwest on occasion. The CDC has done studies of how these cyanobacterial toxins or blue-green toxins has affected dogs over the years. There's been hundreds of cases of dogs falling ill from drinking water and that's been contaminated with these cyanotoxins. And that's for that reason that New York State Department of Environmental Conservation tracks these events carefully across the state. And it's been one of these things where the more they look, the more they expand their program, the more water bodies that are affected. In 2023, there was actually 48 counties in New York State that experienced these events. So that's, this is obviously not, you could use the word ubiquitous, it's fairly common. However, of all the counties in New York State, Suffolk County had more than any other county, and by a good measure. And here I have, for Suffolk County, I have a secondary bar because for one reason or another in 2023, they weren't reporting everything, the data we collected. But even if we didn't use that, just use it purely their data, you can see Suffolk County had more water bodies with these events. And again, that included several here on the North Fork. And I guess the one that's most common on the North Fork, I don't know how many people know Lake Marituka. It's sort of tucked away, it's not very big, but that's reliably every year seems to have one of these events. And just to talk about the role of nitrogen briefly, this is a paper that I published with some colleagues a few years ago. I won't go all into the details, I kind of already said it, but I will just show you, and any organic chemists in the room? Oh wait, we do actually have one here. But say for that, any other chemists in the room? Well, you don't need to be a chemist actually to get the point I'm going to make here. This is that toxic molecule I mentioned, microcystin. I just put a red circle around the end. That N stands for nitrogen. It's just simply to show you this is a very nitrogen-rich compound. And it's again for that reason, when the organism gets more nitrogen, it can make more of this, and when it's starved for nitrogen, it makes less. Okay. And now to move into the marine realm, I'll first talk about Alexandrium. Alexandrium is a dinoflagellate. There's a little picture of it there on your left, and there's the compound it makes, saxitoxin, in the upper right. Saxitoxin is a neurotoxin that can be quite potent, and you can see the syndrome that's called their paralytic shellfish poisoning. Filter feeding bivalves are a common route for human exposure. They filter the water, or as an example, you've probably maybe heard this before. An oyster, for example, can filter 50 gallons of water a day. So, and therefore that can whatever's in the water can concentrate within the filter feeding organism. Although I won't give a bivalve physiology lecture, but simply say that actually oysters are pretty good at selecting what they eat compared to, say, mussels, but that's a long story. But this can be a serious issue. In 2020, there was an event, for example, in Alaska, which has by far the largest coastline in the U.S. that so large that it's not well monitored, and there's indigenous people who rely on shellfish, and the indigenous people that actually aren't part of, or at least at this time weren't part of a national monitoring program. So, and in other countries, this happens as well. I will say in this state, the state is very good at monitoring this organism and in shellfish. This map here shows you where we've seen the organism and a general sense of their densities, and in the red is where we see the highest levels. And over time, we've had PSP-induced shellfish bed closures in New York. I'm showing some of them here, and we had several more in the Peconic Estuary in 2023, and I just coupled together in this slide the 4 different locations that have had PSP events on the North Fork, and particularly you can see they're all kind of close together, Manitowoc, Coral, here in the North Fork. And I will just say, this is pretty unusual with regards to I think there's been a total of 8 locations. So now these were all in creeks, right? And so that these are areas, this gives us some sense as to, what's the commonality of the creek? Well, the water is retained in there, so the cells can grow, and also they can tend to have high nitrogen. And so just to show you the role of nitrogen here, this is an experiment we did a couple of years ago. We've done many of these, but here's just an example where we collected water, put that water in a bottle, and then added either nitrogen or phosphorus or both compounds, and you can see the very strong response from the addition of nitrogen. And that wasn't shocking because we had published a couple of papers prior that made links between nitrogen, high levels of nitrogen, and the more rapid growth of this organism. And again, I won't do the organic chemistry lesson, but that compound saxitoxin, I won't go back. Was anybody paying attention and looking for the nitrogen in that molecule? If you were, you would have seen that as also a nitrogen-rich compound. And again, it's been shown that the nitrogen in the water can stimulate both the growth of the organism and the increase in toxin synthesis by the organism. And then the last of these marine dinoflagellates I'll mention is called sister species to Alexandrium. This is Dinophysis. You can see it called something called diabetic shellfish poisoning. So this is not as much of a threat, but definitely is a gastrointestinal issue. And again, an organism that's widespread. In fact, we found it everywhere. So it's very, very common. It's not always at very high levels, but it can be. And just as a couple of quick examples of that, we had an event last year where it grew to 100 million cells per liter, which is just enormous density. We thought before that, I won't go into the details, but we thought that it never got higher than 2 million cells per liter, but it did. And this was a complete surprise. No one had monitored this particular location before this time. This was Little Seatuck Cove in Moriches Bay. We worked very closely with the DEC and with Suffolk County. In fact, every week all of us are sharing information. These high levels persisted. The shellfish were shown to have some toxins in them. Now this area was already closed to shellfishing, but there was an added closure put on because of this. And then just this week in Reeves Bay, so in the Peconic Estuary, one of my students was out and took the picture on the left and the microscopic image on the right of 60 million cells per liter. So this organism can grow very, very dense. And again, is fueled, shown here. These are the studies essentially we published through the years, so showing the important role that nitrogen can play in fueling these types of events as well. Okay. So just moving away from the ornithologists for a moment and to focus on oxygen. Of course, all marine life needs oxygen to survive outside of some bacteria that we're aware of. And we know that higher levels of nitrogen lead to higher levels of phytoplankton. When those phytoplankton decay, that is broken down, and that consumes oxygen out of the water and can lead to low levels of oxygen. And the DEC has very careful monitoring, or I should say guidelines, for oxygen in water. As it turns out, the Clean Water Act, there's rules for many things, but there's no rules for nitrogen as per the Clean Water Act. There's no rules for phosphorus, there's no rules for levels of algae. But every state in the union has to have a standard for oxygen. So here in New York, there's 2 standards. One's called the chronic, one's called the acute. But essentially, they don't want to see oxygen levels below 4.8 milligrams per liter. They say they should never get below 3 milligrams per liter. But the fact of the matter is, those levels happen all the time, unfortunately. And so this is monitoring just from last summer. And you can see almost every site doesn't make that statement. Now, it's a little bit tricky because this may be a case of the technology, or I should say regulations not keeping up with technology. A decade ago, people would say, oh, the oxygen levels in all of our waters are great. And that's because when you go out during the day and you measure the levels of oxygen, they're great, right? They're very, very high. But as it turns out, oxygen levels are very sensitive to the sun, due to photosynthesis. And they go through a day-night cycle. I'm going to actually show one of these momentarily. And so if you measure the oxygen during the day, it looks great. But at night, it sags down. And that sagging down gets worse when there's more nitrogen fueling those phytoplankton. And just, I'm going to show very quickly a little experiment about, does this low oxygen matter? This is just an experiment my student did at the Marine Lab in Southampton, which is my primary location. And he took water from the Marine Lab, brought it in, and you can see he sent it through a maze and vigorously aerated it before putting it into buckets where he held shellfish, and essentially did a very simple experiment. Took the water directly from the pond and then took it after bubbling, just to see, and put shellfish in there and gave them a couple of weeks just to see how do they do, what are the impacts. And so here are those day-night cycles. And so here's one of those locations that doesn't quite make 3 milligrams per liter. Again, if you went during the day to measure those oxygen levels, almost every day, save for one in this this data set, they look fine. But it's just at night, it's going down, and not even that low. This isn't that bad. It's, I can point to other locations where it gets very, very low. So the question is does it even matter that it gets low for just a little bit? Well, again, he figured out a way to fix that via his maze and the aeration. So that set up a perfect experiment. There are the two conditions. And as it turns out, it does matter. With regards to oysters, you can get the growth rate of oysters to almost double by giving them higher levels of oxygen. And in the right, you can see a correlation, at least for scallops and oysters, between how much they benefited from the aeration and how much of those low oxygen conditions they're exposed to at night. And this has important ecosystem implications because small shellfish don't survive. This is a graph showing the smaller a clam is, or the size, multiple sizes of clams, and how long they survive over just really a month or so. And you see, when the clams are very, very small and you put them out, they're not going to survive. And so, and even if you can see, even if they get a little bit bigger, they're still very, very low. So those slow growth rates that I just showed you have important implications. Right? If they're growing slower, they're stuck at these lower levels for a longer period of time, more likely to be eaten. And this is just a little aside, I won't say much about it, but oftentimes when organizations go to plant clams, they're planting these little tiny clams. And so just as a quick aside, planting little clams can feel good, but those little clams are like popcorn for crabs. And so instead, what we want to do is getting the clams bigger and planting them out when they're large. Okay, I'm going to pivot now just for a moment to talk a little bit about climate change. You hear about it all the time, and I think it's a really important subject, particularly if we're planning for the future, because it's something that's not going to change. We may or may not want to use the term Anthropocene, and it's just simply meant to talk about the era we're in, an era where the effects of man on climate and the environment are outweighing the natural processes. Some scientists have rejected this as a term, others have embraced it. You can make your own decision. I won't tell you what I feel about it. But I do think that we should be thinking about climate change when it comes to management. And so just for some highlights, the levels of CO2 in our atmosphere today, I just pulled down this data just today, just for you, are almost as high. They're just coming down off of the all-time highs at 427. I put this up because this is a plot that never fails to astonish me. Probably the only person in the room who's always looking at these levels, but I look at these because I often are, in my lab, we often do experiments to try to understand how CO2 is affecting marine life. And so to do that, what you always want to do is have a control condition and then an elevated condition. Well, those levels are always changing. You know, when I started these experiments, the control was about 350. Now we're at what you can see below. And coupled with that, of course, there's warming going on. Last year was the warmest year on record by a lot. And it's kind of astonishing, but we've just had our 12th month in a row that was the warmest month ever. And so that red line is showing June 23 to May 24, and all the squiggle below it is every other year that they've measured. So that this trend of warming continues to the point where I think I just heard the other day. I don't know how they can determine this. I guess by probability that no matter what happens now, 2024 will be within the top 5 warmest years. But I guess that's easy to predict, given what's already happened. And it's not just our atmosphere. Our oceans are the warmest they've ever been for this time of year. So that I'm showing you there the 2023 and 2024 data. And I just pulled this down. It's the data on it. You can see it. So this is data as of yesterday. We can now monitor ocean temperatures via satellite, almost every square kilometer, almost every day. And this whole year, any day of the year, I could have said, this is the warmest the ocean's ever been for this day of the year, and it's been true. So it's not just the land, it's also in the water. And it's also right here. One thing I always try to emphasize when people talk about global climate change, and the Earth may warm by 2 degrees, and just to be really upfront, that's not important for us, right? It's important for the rest of the globe. And if we're just thinking about our own ecosystems, what's important is what's happening right here. And during summer, this century, our waters have been warming significantly faster than the global average. Now, I can point to other places that are actually cooling during that same period of time. And other seasons, like our springs, are not getting that much warmer. But in our summer, the rate of warming is significantly faster than the global average. This is based on that satellite data. The squiggles that you can see in most of that graph is statistically significant data. It's done by one of my graduate students, and it's a rapid rate of warming, and it hasn't. The data is now almost 4 years old, but this trend is held up. This is water. So this is the water. Yeah, this map of showing the water. That's the rate of change of temperature per year within the water. And a second thing that's changing also is rainfall, but it's changing in a way. The total amount of rainfall hasn't changed much, but what has changed a lot are the events that we're getting. And I feel like I never want to trust my instincts, but I feel like just instinctually, when you see some of the rain events that we had, say last winter and last summer, and even recently, they feel like tropical deluges. So there's a lot falling all at once. And this is just to give an example of some of these rain events from last summer. Some look modest, but there are some events, 4 inches of rain in a day or 2 inches of rain in a day. It's a lot. And in fact, we live in a part of the country where it's not just my eyeball. Here's NOAA data showing how since the 20th century, the Northeast is having more of these heavy all at once rainfall events. And this is also NOAA data on the right showing that the 1 in 100 storm, 1 in 100 year storm is now happening every 10 years. Again, more commonly in our precise, almost through the bullseye there. And that's just a video. That's not a river you're looking at there. That's supposed to be a little path that goes down. That's at a little park in Southampton. But it just shows you, and we've all seen this. You get one of these events. And I will say this is, when you do get these events, these are the kind of events that can saturate the ground, and that's when you can get runoff. You can get direct runoff. On average, this doesn't happen, but this can happen under this scenario. And I just point out this paper, making a nitrogen link, a colleague of mine from Stanford did this study. Looking forward, there's going to be more precipitation. And that, that with that more precipitation will bring more nitrogen. And that, there'll be 33% more nitrogen coming in with more precipitation. And this is just sort of showing across the nation where that's expected to happen. And you can see it's, again, we're in the part of the country that that is supposed to be an issue, or meant to be an issue. Okay. And again, on the climate change front, I just want to emphasize that there's lots of things going on all at once. So there's the rainfall, there's the temperature, warmer water holds less oxygen. So those oxygen issues I mentioned become more significant. I won't even have time to talk about ocean acidification, and we've talked about on global warming. And sometimes I've called these the four horsemen of the ocean climate change apocalypse, but maybe that's too hyperbolic. But I will just say, when we think about marine life, we need to think about all these things together. And we've had fisheries that have either collapsed, like the lobster, and American lobster fishery is now gone from our waters. It's moved to Maine, and even in Maine, it's moving north just to stay in that thermal optimum. And we have other shellfish populations that are definitely have died back significantly, and that's related to increasing temperatures and in some cases nitrogen as well. And the thing I'll say about temperatures is that we're not in the driver's seat here, right? We're part of, obviously, they do call it global climate change for a reason. That we've got 1.3 billion people in India, 1.3 billion people in China, and 1 billion people in Africa, and so temperatures are going to keep rising. But the interesting thing in the nitrogen front, we now pivot back to nitrogen, is that there's something that we may be in the driver's seat of. And then I'm going to shortly talk about the Suffolk County Sub-Watersheds Plan. This is a figure out of that plan. And what it's contrasting is if nothing is done in the left, and if we implement that plan in the lower right. And these are nitrate concentrations in groundwater. And the spots that are in the red, for example, those are those really high levels. And you can see those, and even in the orange and yellow, those levels we really don't want to have, and they become less common with implementing that plan, as you can see. And so just to talk about why we might mitigate nitrogen, turns out we've actually already done this in New York. And so you might be familiar, there's something called the Long Island Sound Study, which was put together by the EPA. It was a management plan that involved both New York and Connecticut, and it was an ambitious plan to reduce nitrogen loading by 60%. Very large number. It cost a lot of money. It's mainly done by upgrading sewage treatment plants. But it's had a big effect. So on the left is what the plan, that low oxygen zone looked like in Long Island Sound before the implementation of the plan. And on the right is what's happened since then. And what hopefully you can see that there's a whole zone now that is experiencing significantly higher oxygen levels. And I've shown you already like how important it is, not just for shellfish, but obviously fish are even more sensitive to low oxygen. And this just shows the relationship between the decreasing levels of nitrogen and the size of that low oxygen zone. And it's a pretty close relationship, some deviation in the beginning, but particularly this century, in the last 20 years, they've decreased sort of hand in hand. And now we're in a position to do something more local. So, just cutting to the chase on the nitrogen, you heard me say, oh, most of the nitrogen is coming from wastewater. So those who don't know, this is, say for Greenport, the entire portion of Greenport, I believe, the entire North Fork, this is our scenario where we have on-site septic systems that are draining into our groundwater source, and that groundwater source is our drinking water source and affecting surface waters. And that sub-watersheds plan, I put the tagline in there for worst first. I mean, I think we could well, I shouldn't think anything, I'll just say, speak for myself. The idea of draining our wastewater right to our drinking water source probably wasn't a great one for, and in fact, actually, the EPA has literally brought legal action against Suffolk County for that practice. But I can also say now that Suffolk County has the most progressive and well thought of plan for upgrading septic systems of any county really in the country. And I can say this because at the Center for Clean Water Technology, we're looking carefully at states that are in similar situations: Florida, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Virginia, Maryland. None of them have a plan like this. And actually, to the contrary, I have colleagues in all these places, even Hawaii. They're coming here to Suffolk County saying, "How did you do that?" They're really amazed. And it's both because they now, well, firstly, I'll point out here, maybe I'll finish my sentence instead. It's both because there's a plan to implement it and there's funding behind it, right? And so it's one thing to say, oh, here's our plan. But, for those of you who don't know, Suffolk County now offers $10,000 to $20,000 in grants. New York State has $10,000 in grants. And Southhold doesn't have this plan yet, but maybe it can be encouraged. In Southampton and East Hampton, they're offering people $20,000 in grants to upgrade their systems. Along with pressure on the town officials here, but maybe something similar could be put forward as motivation. But within the plan, I can say it's a very carefully thought out plan. If you look at that pink line, that's the highest priority for upgrading systems. And hopefully you can see this was very carefully thought out. If this was a willy-nilly plan, there'd just be a pink line that would look the same everywhere. They didn't do that. And instead they were very careful and said, well, where's the public drinking water supplies? Let's make sure we upgrade there. Where are the water bodies where there's a lot of impairment? Let's make sure we upgrade there. And so, for example, on the North Shore, on the Long Island Sound side, actually the water quality on Long Island Sound out here is excellent, right? And therefore, that's a low priority. But on the Peconic side, I think you've seen already that the harmful algal blooms, the low oxygen conditions, that's an area that should be targeted for upgrades. So this slide, and I'll just come back to this and just say, this is happy news. That rapid transit of groundwater here is happy news. Some of the pesticides that used to be used 20 years ago, and then use has stopped, you can see the levels declining in the groundwater, right? And what that's such a hopeful sign, because what that tells you is that action taken now for nitrogen can be realized in that same time frame. So, as part of the plan, there's now a series of systems that are commercial systems that are available for install. It was mentioned, I do direct the New York State Center for Clean Water Technology, where we're harnessing science to engineer clean water solutions for the protection of public health and the environment in New York and beyond. And we are happy to have designed a particular system that virtually is the only one designed just on Long Island. It's fairly simple. It's made of sand and wood chips for the most part. It utilizes a drain field that used to be illegal up until a few years ago in Suffolk County, although it was very common everywhere else. But it uses a drain field to distribute that wastewater. And we've got two different designs that have achieved the lowest levels of nitrogen in effluent of any system installed in Suffolk County. So the two in red are the two of our nitrogen removing biofilters. One's called a box system, another called a line system. And just to be clear, this is the line system because we have a liner that goes around that lower layer with the wood chips and the sand mixed together. The box system actually has those wood chips in a separate box. But those two systems, and this is Suffolk County data, have the lowest levels of nitrogen coming out of it. And they're fairly, like I said, fairly simple operation. They run on one single pump, and we're actually working on a variety now that would be, we've already have installed, that are gravity fed. And so with that, that would be the only system that's completely passive. Because right now, we have one that's running on just a single pump. Depends on your home and depends on the size. So, yeah, I have to do some math, but they do require more square footage than a normal system. But a normal system is, you could just be the size of this table. The drain field part might be like not quite half of, maybe a third of the room here. So it's size, you need to have the space. And we're working on other solutions to make them smaller as well. And then, of course, beyond nitrogen, there's plenty of other things we don't want getting into our groundwater. That could be coming from household drugs, pharmaceuticals, solvents, personal care products. These systems remove, and this is data out of Bruce's lab, in fact, Bruce Bonnewell's lab, essentially showing that these systems can remove, in some cases, well, the removal percentages here are as good or better than you get out of a sewage treatment plant. And none of the other systems tested have gone through this testing. So it's not just the nitrogen, it's also these compounds. And it all the removal happens in the sand layer, which again is unique to the system we have. And these systems have received what's called provisional approval. And we even have a company that installs them. This is not our company, another company, but we've worked with for many years, XCAV Services. Okay, and then the final thing I'll just mention, or just the fact that, so it's going, like I said, water travels fairly quickly through the aquifer here in the North Fork, but still, it's going to take some time for that to come out. And so there are things we can do in the meanwhile to also address the nitrogen, both just before it discharges and once it's in the water. And so the first thing I'll just mention is something called permeable active barriers. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but at the Center for Clean Water Technology, Dr. Nils Vogelborn has spearheaded the installation of these. And the idea, it says waste there, but really it can just be nitrogen. And the idea is that you can put in a barrier before groundwater discharges into surface waters, and that barrier can remove the nitrate. Now you wouldn't want to do this across the entire, for example, Conic estuary, but if there were a particular area with very high levels of nitrate, this has been done in other places successfully to get that nitrate out of the groundwater before it discharges in surface waters. Just mentioned work that we've done with seaweed, specifically kelp. Seaweeds, as everyone knows, are photosynthetic. They take up CO2. We have too much CO2 in our estuaries. They take up nitrogen. They provide oxygen, and they might even help with harmful algal blooms to some extent. In my lab, this is being updated. We've got more sites in the season, but we've grown kelp from Fisher's Island all the way to the Bronx River estuary, and it's grown well in almost all cases. It can remove a lot of nitrogen. So we work, I should mention, I should say here, we're working mainly at oyster farms and seeing this as a venue or an opportunity for oyster farmers to have a secondary crop. And the advantage there being that oyster farmers have less to do during the winter when the oysters aren't growing much, and this grows during the winter. And so we just did a calculation here of how much nitrogen you can remove with the kelp, and this isn't based on a guess. In all those cases, we've been measuring the nitrogen that the kelp is taking up, and it can be up to 200 pounds of nitrogen on a 1 acre kelp farm, which is not unrealistic. There's now the first commercial kelp farm in Moriches Bay is about an acre in size. And that's the equivalent of upgrading, somewhere in the vicinity of 10 septic systems. So this could be part of the toolbox, as they say, as well. And there's some secondary beyond the nitrogen. I'll just show that kelp can also help with other things. I've mentioned ocean acidification. We grew kelp, oysters with kelp in a setup whereby we have on that oyster farm or next to that oyster farm, It's actually Violet Cove is the one that has the commercial kelp. This was just experimental, but we grew oysters on their own in the kelp and next to the kelp. This is mapping the pH around the kelp, and you can see that tongue of higher pH water. And we did that mapping. This was by a remotely operated vehicle that had a water quality sensor in it. We also put out paired sensors both in the kelp and next to the kelp. Again, the kelp, at least at the beginning of this experiment, led to higher levels of pH in the water. Oysters like high pH instead of low pH, and the oysters grew faster. They grew faster in the kelp compared to outside, and faster inside compared to next to, and next to grew faster compared to far away. And the very last thing I'll just mention is there's also interaction between kelp and harmful algal blooms, and I've already mentioned Alexandrium. And you're looking at a picture here of a Alexandrium cell that's healthy and one that's been exposed to kelp. And you can see we call that the Alexandrium cell spilling its guts to the kelp. And instead of a picture, if we wanted to see data, this was growing Alexandrium. This is actually during a bloom, collecting the water, growing it, with no amendment, with adding nutrients. And the last one at the end is adding nutrients, so they still have the nutrients, but also the kelp, which is called acetylsysma, acetylsysma, and it grew significantly. Well, not only did it grow slower, it actually died. And we're working on other seaweeds, particularly red branching macroalgae. You see my student Tim Curtin holding those there. These are natural components of the ecosystem, and they grow in warm water. And so the kelp is in the winter. We actually need the help more in the summer, and so we're looking at these other organisms, other seaweeds as well. But I do talk about this idea of the halo effect. We're not fixing our nitrogen problems with kelp, with the very bad news, and we're not correcting climate change with kelp, but we can, in a small scale area, create this halo that's specifically beneficial to shellfish, and specifically probably oysters. Okay, I'm done. Just some quick final points. I mentioned high nitrogen from wastewater is a threat to coastal ecosystems and human health. Climate change is accelerating, and along with nitrogen, they're having together a compounding effect on coastal ecosystems. Upgrading septic systems is probably our primary mitigation strategy for improving water quality and improving groundwater quality. And that seaweeds, permanently active barriers, and even shellfish do hold the promise to regionally address water quality here. Okay, thanks for listening. Lights aren't on, but I see a question already. Yes, sir. I'll just repeat the question for this first one. He mentioned, he said climate change with respect to rising water. And so that's certainly a serious issue as well. And we know that already there's been, I had this number at the tip of my tongue, let's see if I can get it right. A foot of sea level rise since the middle of the 20th century. And what happens this century going forward could be anywhere from another foot to 3 feet, depending on what happens with carbon emissions. And so, yeah, that's certainly a serious issue. Certainly flooding becomes an issue as well. I mean, it's do you have any graphics on it? Well, I know I did a study following Sandy, where, I mean, I'm sure many people here know, but the Orient was its own island during Hurricane Sandy. Shouldn't be smiling or laughing when I say that. It's like, and that can be more, that likelihood, that will become more likely going forward as sea level rises. So, just another motivation for addressing the carbon issue.
The filtration of the toxins and stuff that you showed that graph, and do they also help with the PFAS chemicals?
So this is the septic systems, and actually they don't remove PFAS. They, unfortunately, they remove 1,4-dioxane. That was like a happy, unexpected outcome, but it looks like on the PFAS front, that they're not active towards that, but there are things that could be done on that front, and that might be something we'll be thinking about. In the future as maybe an add-on to some of these systems. I'm gonna let the Maggie or whoever has the microphones choose.
Is nitrates routinely tested for in water up here?
So if you are a public water supply, absolutely. So Suffolk County Water Authority is testing for nitrate at a minimum quarterly. And Suffolk County Water Authority is probably one of the most aggressive water purveyors, certainly on Long Island. I would dare say, well, I'll just leave it at that. One of the most in that, if any contaminant level gets to half of the standard, so it's 10 milligrams per liter, for example, for nitrate. If it gets to 5, they start treating that water. So they will not deliver water that's even at half of the maximum allowable limit. They don't need to do that. That's just their policy. So I think that's now if you have a private well, you should be tested. I up until 2020, for almost 15 years, I was on private. And I tested, and in hindsight, I wish I tested more, because what happened over time is the nitrate levels started creeping up. Started at 2, I ended at 7, and just happy to get that public water.
Are there any chemicals or substances that can be used in fertilizers as a substitute to nitrogen?
I mean, nitrogen serves a purpose in fertilizer, and so I think, and if applied properly, nitrogen fertilizer doesn't need to get into our groundwater. And so the two things that can, we feed the world because of fertilizer. So it's the misuse of fertilizer that becomes a problem. So over fertilization is a problem, and then also there are differences in types of fertilizers. Some synthetic fertilizers very quickly dissolve and can very more quickly migrate down into the groundwater, whereas some more organic-based fertilizers are slower to decompose and slower to release. So, but I think in many cases, people aren't sure how much fertilizer to use, and that can lead to over-fertilization.
Can you talk to the idea of how frequently and how locally nitrogen gets measured within the creeks and inlets around here? And is there anything to be gained by getting a little more granular in that test?
Yeah, I mean, Suffolk County does test most of the major tributaries, but not super frequently. And there can be value, I think, in having more information. The one thing is that, just for anybody who's interested in this, there's different types of nitrogen out there, and it's really, in my mind, the most important thing to measure is what's called total nitrogen. In groundwater, the nitrate stays the nitrate, but as soon as that gets released in the surface waters, organisms take it up. So sometimes you can actually go to a high, and this will sound counterintuitive, but you can go to an area receiving a lot of nitrogen, and you can go to measure the nitrate, and you'll measure 0. And it's because the plants are taking up as soon as it comes in. But if you measure total nitrogen, you're actually capturing those cells in the other forms. And so anyway, if there is monitoring, that's the form that's important to be measured.
And talking about plants and the total nitrogen, and reducing lawns, can you discuss a little bit about adding native plants, reducing lawns, and trying to educate the population about that? And my second question was also, you said that you test sometimes you test the water coming in. Many people I know have the reverse osmosis systems, and they're very worried about their own drinking water. How worried should we be here?
Again, I think data is power. And so, you know, if you have a private well, you should be testing. If you have public water, it's being tested. And it's being treated if it's not meeting the standard. And you can always do additional testing, but that I should also say that, you know, the testing data is also publicly available, so you could go and, you know, and you should. It's good, important information to have. Yeah, and then to the lawns and native plantings, again, I'll emphasize, you know, wastewater is the biggest source. And particularly in suburban areas, we're just thinking about homes, you know, fertilizer definitely contributes. But as I mentioned before, I think the big thing there is slow release or fast release, not over fertilizing. Yeah, and certainly on the native plantings, that's, you know, there are certainly some invasives that can become problems, particularly in coastal systems. Yeah.
So the seaweed takes up nitrogen and the shellfish take up nitrogen. So when the seaweed dies, or what happens then? Because it's like, okay, so we can have a lot of seaweed, it's got nitrogen, then what? You know?
Yeah, so I mean, the whole point is to grow it as a crop, right? So you're farming it, and so the kelp, if you leave it in, will die in the summer. So we actually remove it in, say, May or June. And then from there, I mean, there's many potential applications. People are looking into, for example, they call it bioplastics. There are pharmaceutical and nutraceutical products to be had. We've been using it to actually create a fertilizer. And a soil amendment product, and it's done very, very well. And in fact, we've even done things where we blended the kelp with some other seaweeds. Kelp happens to be lower in nitrogen relative to carbon, but enriched in some other compounds. And conversely, the ones that grow in summer have more nitrogen. And so we found that putting those together makes a really nice soil amendment, and to the point where we can actually get plant growth that looks like fertilized, commercial fertilizer. That would be slow release fertilizer.
I have a question related to the rust tide that we've seen proliferation of the last 2 to 3 years.
Yes,
I
didn't
have,
get a chance to talk about that, but
I happen to travel a boat in Little Cotton, Great Cotton Place, so that's what I'm concentrating my comments on. It seems to have been temperature dependent, or day temperatures get up around 80 degrees, which is end of August, September. My understanding is that this comes to the surface during the day and sinks at night. And when it sinks at night, while it's not toxic itself, but it affects the benthic organisms on the bottom. I'm thinking of the aquaculture lease program that the county has is a long way of getting to the question. Is this why we're seeing more surface mounted gear associated with the aquaculture lease program to try to help prevent this occurrence at the end of August, September?
firstly, let me say that you're very well educated on this topic, so you almost gave my talk up right there, so congratulations on that. And just to close the loop on what you were saying on that particular organism, again, I couldn't talk about everything here, but since you brought it up, that organism was never seen in our waters in the 20th century, but you almost hit it right in the head, 80 degrees. Believe it or not, our waters didn't hit 80 degrees in the 20th century. Now they always do. And that's the sweet spot. So this organism went from having no window of opportunity to now in some summers, like 2 months of opportunity. But now getting to your specific question, I don't think that's motivating the people who are growing shellfish. I think they're and in fact, we did a study once and showed that you're spot on that they do migrate up and down, but the surface aggregations are actually denser, and therefore the shellfish are more vulnerable in the surface than in the bottom when those rust tides happen. So the people who have surface aquaculture if there was an area with a lot of rust tide, you know, they could, and I know this has actually happened, not here, it happened during experiments that we did, where we had out scallops and oysters. Scallops at the surface died, the oysters, scallops at the bottom survived, the oysters at the surface, I think some of them died, but the ones at the surface are more vulnerable, because it's, when they're at this, when the rust tide at the surface, it's very dense aggregation. They do dive down at night, but I think they're more dispersed, and therefore they're less.
You mentioned the grants for the nitrogen removing biofilters.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, is that like 40K for a household that wants to put them in, and do you know how much they cost? And then second quick question, do you feel comfortable with something in the day in the summer, or do you check the testing before you get in?
I swim, starting in, actually, I just started, I love open water swimming, I just started, and I'm gonna go through until it gets too cold for me, but, and I just swim. I'm swimming at Shinnecock Bay, I should say. And then on the grants program, the 40,000, that's most reliably in the towns of East Hampton and Southampton. Again, Suffolk County, they say 10 to 20,000, 10,000 from the state. Maybe Southold would have a program at some point, and the cost per home is very per home specific. Sometimes these installs are super easy and they can be as little as $20,000. Sometimes they're really complicated, and you know, the 20,000 is when you can kind of reuse your existing, for example, septic tank and leaching rigs. You know, you can't do that, and then maybe your system is in, there's a bunch of trees that overgrew it, and there's, you know, so it's really site specific. And, you know, so some people will get lucky, like, oh, my system's totally wide open and it's easy. In other cases, it can be a little bit more.
I have a question following up on Nancy's question regarding native plants and green gardens and green barrels. It seems like the message here is that proper fertilizer use and putting in improved septic systems, IA systems are going to be the most effective means to reduce nitrogen. Can you comment on the relative effectiveness of those other practices, the rain barrel, the rain garden, and the native plant?
Yeah, so the rain gardens I can speak to the best. I mean, so the native plant front, it's really gonna depend where that is, like if you're interested, but so on something like a rain garden that's meant to intercept runoff, right? That can be effective on the bacterial front. It may or may not move the needle. It probably would not have a huge impact on the nitrogen and phosphorus front. Right, so the idea again, you don't want to runoff going directly from land into sea. And so if you've got some sort of plantings that can intercept that or send that water into the ground before it goes out to sea, then you'll be removing bacteria. And just, you know, for context, this is always, for me, when I say this, I remind myself this issue. If you didn't know, anyone have a private well here? Drinking water well, okay, right? And so everyone has a private well. You also have a septic system on your property, right? But here's the happy news there. And I had the same situation for, you know, 15 years in my home. Bacteria and viruses are taken out of wastewater as they travel through our sandy aquifer, right? And so, and therefore, one, getting water to ground does a great job of doing that. And we've actually done, for example, a fair bit of work trying, when there are areas with high levels of bacteria in the water, we try to understand where is it coming from. And it's almost never a human signal, except for a marina. Right? And that's because maybe in a marina there's some boat discharge. But even areas that have lots of homes and the main source of nitrogen is wastewater, the bacteria are not coming from the septic system. The bacteria are being retained in the aquifer, and that's why you're drinking your water and you're not getting sick. The viruses and bacteria are being taken out. And so back to the question that, you know, those sort of, anything that's intercepting the runoff before it goes directly into the water and or sending it to ground will be retaining those bacteria. And there will be some vegetative nitrogen and phosphorus uptake as well. So I don't want to say that they're not effective. They're certainly doing that. Yeah, and it's partly also depending on what's the strength of that water coming in, how much nitrogen is actually in there, right? Wastewater, the strength is like 100 milligrams per liter, the runoff could be, it might just be 1 milligram per liter. So, yeah, the plants would help with that. For sure, and also they could be, I guess they're taking out some bacteria.
That's way to go about protesting.
Okay, so I did hear that on this address, so the question was.
What is the best way for home testing private wells?
Yeah, so, I'm nearly certain the Suffolk County Department of Health Services, will do that for you. And if you, yeah, I know they're not super fast, and then otherwise it would be, there are private companies that can do that as well.
It's not what we can, like, gold and water.
Hey, thank you very much for your presentation. I just, for everyone's edification, on Shelter Island, they utilize the WQI money for grants for IA systems. So the town of Southold already has money. They can use up to 20 CPF funds for grants. So I think it's, you have the funds available, you should just petition the town. Or you should just petition the town board to get into that program, so you can amend and provide other monies that are in connection with Suffolk County and also the city.
I have two very local questions. One, you know, there's always a sign in Bulletin and like saying, no, it's one. That has anything to do with the water quality there.
I don't know.
No. Why is it there?
It's not a bathing beach, that is why it's posted as such. It's a liability issue, not the water quality.
Really, thank you. The other question is, on the map, you said the quality of water is better closer to the sound. I was sure what you did from.
Yeah, I mean, the water quality in Long Island Sound, the water quality across the Long Island Sound follows a gradient from New York City out to the Atlantic Ocean. And the further away you get from the city, the better the water quality is. And in general, the water along the North Fork on the Long Island Sound side flushes very, very well. There's lots of tidal exchange, lots of tidal movement, and the water's clear and clean and, you know, but conversely, when you go to the Peconic side, the open waters of the Peconic are generally in fairly good shape. But when you get closer, particularly in some of the creeks, that's, you know, where we're seeing some of the harmful algal blooms, and some of the, you know, low oxygen conditions and such.
Well water.
I wouldn't make that conclusion, no. And so, and again, there's probably areas that are quite similar, but it's the fact that that water on the Peconic side, the tidal range in the Peconics also is much lower than you see on the Long Island Sound.
So back to that thing about lawns and stuff, because when I realized that if you have trees, you've got all these mycorrhiza underneath the tree, you have so much more complexity in that soil. So the more things that are grown, it's much better than lawns. And I think that, and people really need to realize that, because then the water can go into trees, and trees are like a lake or other. So I just think that's really important, whether it's native or not, it's native, but I just think it's important to use the lawn stuff and grow real things so that the soil has more organism, it's complex.
Yeah, I can actually, there is one piece of information that I'll share that does fully support what you're saying. And that is that undisturbed natural vegetation takes more nitrogen out than a lawn area. And I'm just remembering this now. So that is that, you know, I didn't mention it, but you know, there's actually nitrogen coming from the atmosphere all the time. And not just when it rains, right? So nitrogen comes out when it rains, but there's also something called just dry atmospheric deposition. And I'm now remembering that in the nitrogen models, based on data, you know, undisturbed, pristine, like forest and take, when that nitrogen strikes that area, it's better assimilated than it is on lawn, and certainly from there better assimilated than it is on pavement.
I got stuck on your chemistry, charts and everything, and it's been many decades since I did anything with chemistry. But you said that the Suffolk County water is definitely treating our water before it comes into our homes by pipe. Is there something that we could be putting down our drains into our septic system to kind of maybe give a little chance for that stuff to be neutralized or whatever you want to say?
Sure.
Something like that.
So firstly, clarifying my first point. Yeah, Suffolk County Water Authority, if you're on public water, they're testing. And then they treat, if anything is above, they treat for any compound that's above the hat, that gets to 50% of the limit. And what that might be would depend on that source. That's the first, just clarify that first point. On the second point, yeah, unfortunately, actually, there are no additives that make septic systems better for removing nitrogen. And in fact, some of the additives might make them worse. Because the microbes in there, there are things you can add, like you used to have an old home where the septic system was built in the 50s, and then at one time it was filled up and the guy just came, I think it was sulfuric acid, we just dumped in it and cleared it up for maybe for a short period of time. But it didn't do anything to help the system or change what's coming with the system.
So in regard to the natural vegetation versus and it's filtering of nitrogen, both from the rock, from air and through the ground. So in the interest of putting in these IAs, for example, if you had to reduce your trees in the front lawn, let's say 5 to 10 trees, could it be possible that those trees are doing as much work on reducing the nitrogen as putting in IAs?
No. And it's simply because it's because the wastewater is so potent. So it's like 100 milligrams per liter, and just the atmospheric deposition ends up being like 10% of the total nitrogen. And the swap out of trees versus what the vegetation would be very small with regards to dealing with that 10%. So.
Well, just that, but you also said that the microbiome underneath the ground from the trees also is doing some of that, but
It's the answer is that it's
Still not
not close. So
There's that difference, but doesn't it depend on how many people are using that system and all of that, or is it just?
no, certainly every I've said it before, every person has their own nitrogen footprint, every home has its own nitrogen footprint. But those are potent, they really that's why, in any area where you've got any reasonable density of homes, that's the biggest source. Yeah.
I want to thank Dr. Gobler for his time this evening. Very much. I think we could be here all night with the amount of questions that everyone has. It sounds like we need to do a septic program with all those questions. And maybe a native plant program, and we'll put all those things on our list. But I want to introduce Michael Collins, who is our town engineer, the supervisor. Couldn't be here tonight. he wanted to be here tonight, but he's at the Tonic Landing, speaking to them. And, Michael's got a few things he wants to let us know.
So there are a couple of questions about the grant program. Okay, so that is actually a specific policy that the town board has followed. When you hear the numbers being thrown around on the South Fork, East Hampton collects about 5 to 6 times as much money from CPF, Southampton, so we're about 8 to 10 times as much. And it's frankly much more cost effective for us to continue to live in land up here rather than financing individual systems. The best way to treat waste is not to create. So when you preserve land, if you take it out of development, that is a far more effective use of those dollars that are collected than using that to subsidize those food systems. And then on the other front, for bacteria, Dan also could not be here tonight, South Highway Superintendent. We have had a very aggressive program over the last 5 years. We have cut 55% of all the stormwater outfalls townwide to the water bodies. Traditionally, old school drainage was you found the lowest place in the neighborhood, you put all of a pipe and you jet it right into the creeks. We're eliminating that water body by water body, street by street, and we anticipate within another couple of years that number will be down probably somewhere less than 25% of those will remain. And the ones that we're targeting are the largest ones that have the largest impact, and we're hoping that that will have a significant impact in decreasing the bacteria that counts.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Professor Gobler. And,
Hey. Yeah.